All right, so we've got some beautiful light here. As you can see, we got some evening light, and right from this position, it is side light. Okay, now, we're not going to go out and take photographs or make photographs right now, but I want to show you something about exposure, because this is a topic that is very confusing to people. Are you confused by exposure? All right, well, let's take a look at how it actually works and what it's actually doing. All right, so if you can fill a cup from a faucet, you can master exposure. It's not that complicated. Now, when we're talking about exposure, all we're talking about is the total amount of light recorded, which translates to brightness. So the visual result of exposure is brightness. How much light are you recording? And so it's a quantity. So when we talk about exposure, all we're talking about is the quantity of light. How much? I'm going to show you a real simple way to understand how exposure works. Let's take a look. Exposure works very much like filling a cup from a faucet. And since light behaves like particles, because it is particles and also a wave, but we think of it as particles for our purposes here. Because light behaves like particles, we can really think of it behaving a lot like water, especially water from a faucet, for the purposes of exposure. All right, so in a faucet, we have a valve that turns on and off. All right, so when we turn the valve on, our exposure begins. And when we turn it off, the exposure ends. So let's do it. All right, well, we just made an exposure. Now let's look at a couple of more details. How does aperture work? Well, in the camera system, aperture is an opening in the lens. It's a series of blades that form a diaphragm that contracts and opens and contracts and opens. That's the aperture. Now, how does that relate to exposure? Let's take a look. So in exposure, the aperture has the effect of controlling the volume of light coming in, very much like a valve would on a faucet. So let's take a look. Now, if we close the valve a little bit, we have more of a trickle. And if we open the valve all the way, we have a very high volume. Let's take a look. All right. So that valve opening all the way, that would be the equivalent of opening the aperture to its widest setting in the lens. So what does that mean? Well, we're letting more light in. Okay? So watch the aperture work. And so here it's all the way open. We're going to close the aperture down. And as we close it, we get less light, right? Because light behaves like water. We open the aperture. We close the aperture. It's a very simple demonstration of what aperture is actually doing in terms of exposure. All right, so what about shutter speed? Well, let's take a look. So in the faucet, the shutter speed is just the faucet turning on and then off. In the camera, you actually have a little curtain that opens and closes, and that lets the light on the sensor, and then it closes to stop the light falling on the sensor. So we begin filling the pixels with light, and then we stop filling the pixels with light. The shutter is essentially what turns the exposure on and then off, okay? All right, so I want to refine this demonstration a little bit. So in the camera, the shutter won't work exactly like turning this on and off. So shutter, like I said, is the curtain that opens and then closes, opens and then closes. So you open it to start the exposure, and then the shutter closes to end the exposure. So that is in the camera how the shutter would work. So in real life, light is always flowing. It's just it's going through the lens, and then it's the shutter that opens to allow that light to fill the pixels, and then closes to end that exposure. So in real life, the light never really stops flowing unless there's some other circumstances like flash. But in generally speaking, there's always light bombarding us, and we need the camera to control that flow of light. All right, another thing I want to touch on is people ask this all the time. So how do these settings actually work together? The shutter speed, the aperture, the ISO. We talk about this triangle, even though I'm saying it's not a triangle. I don't teach it that way. It's a faucet. But how do these settings work together? Well, right now, I'm just showing you aperture and shutter speed. Now, instinctively, like I said, if you can fill a cup with water from a faucet, then instinctively you already kind of know how exposure works. You've just probably never seen it this way. So let's take a look. All right, so let's take a look at what happens when we have a wide open aperture, which means a great volume of light. Shutter opens, pixels filled, shutter closes. Now you notice we didn't need a very long duration for that pixel to fill up. Let's see what happens when we have a much lower volume of light. In other words, the aperture would be closed down quite a bit. Okay, so now we have a much lower volume of light. Shutter opens. And notice now we need a much slower shutter speed, a much longer duration to get the same exposure, the same quantity of light. So that's how the two settings work together. So we can see that aperture and shutter speed directly affect the exposure. In other words, the amount of light recorded. In other words, the brightness. So when we're changing shutter speed and aperture, all we're doing there for the purposes of exposure is controlling how much light is getting in and filling up the pixels, okay? And that is our exposure, that is our brightness. Now, another time we will talk about ISO and how that also affects the brightness. So again, I hope that sheds some light, so to speak, on shutter speed, aperture, and how they actually work in exposure. And no, I do not teach the exposure triangle because it's not a triangle. It's a faucet, okay? All right. Thanks for watching.